It's been a month since the US election. Something which helped prepare me for the possibility of a Trump win was my interview with journalist Andrew Naughtie back in October. He made the point that, for many Americans, their experience of Trump's first term was fine, yet after 4 years of Biden, they felt they were worse off. After an appropriate period of mourning, I asked Andrew back to discuss the results. The main thing we focus on is the widening gulf between the campaign that various people say happened and the one which actually did. It's only by keeping in mind the latter that I think Democrats can hope to recover. There's occasional static in Andrew's audio, but overlook it and keep listening. Andrew.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Good to be back.
Under less than hoped for circumstances the last time we spoke.
Suboptimal circumstances.
I guess I'll start with, you went to America in the last few days leading up to the election.
Mm-hmm. That I did.
What was it like in those days leading up? And then what was your experience of election night?
Well, the first thing I'll say is it's not just that hindsight is a beautiful thing, but also hindsight alters the salience of different things that you notice. And I now look back and I can tell that there are some things that I noticed but didn't give enough heed to that actually have become very dominant themes in all of the post-game analysis. So one of the things I did, for instance, I was in Milwaukee for a day and I talked to a bunch of people outside a Trump rally who were enthusiastic about him, some of whom seemed to have voted for him before, some of whom hadn't, but all of whom were very clear that they were going to vote for him. I didn't go to the actual rally because I've been to a Trump rally before and they are absolutely excruciating to sit through because they're so boring. And if I had gone, I wouldn't have been able to get home because he was so late. I just talked to the people outside. Every single person mentioned food prices. Every single person. I've been to I've lived in the US before. I've covered elections there before. You're used to hearing everyone talk about gas prices, obviously meaning petrol. Food prices less so. And there is a theme going around and I say left, I mean kind of left of Trump. There is a theme going around that's saying we didn't grasp that people cared more about the price of eggs than they did about whether or not their daughter would die in hospital while having a miscarriage. Well, I mean, sure, but it's not just that people are annoyed at the expensive price of food. If you have 4 or 5 kids and need to get through a lot of milk and a lot of eggs and a lot of bread in a week, your circumstances have changed significantly in the last 4 years. Now, we can all rehearse the arguments about why or at what pace or whether what Biden's done has helped ameliorate this, which it has. The point is how people feel. And you can't win an election by telling people that they feel wrongly about their circumstances. It just doesn't work. So I should have noticed that more. I didn't. I knew it was happening. The other thing, though, that I really should have paid more attention to, again, I noticed but didn't notice enough, was that at this Trump rally, in a city that's famously very segregated, the crowd was extremely diverse by American standards. Very much, and on every measure, any class signifier you can think of, how people present racially, age. It was very gender split. It was just quite a lot of young people in particular. It was very noticeably coalitional rather than a hardcore of white suburbanites. And that matches the result as far as the exit polls are concerned. And I should have noticed that more. And a lot of people didn't, because I think a lot of people, we knew as journalists there's been this move toward him among Latino men and black men in particular, but generally the block of people reliably voting Republican is less white than it was. We didn't anticipate what has happened now fully, and we should have. Obviously, who shows up at rallies is not the same as polling, but it is worth bearing in mind that people have better things to do on Friday afternoon than wait for 4 hours for Donald Trump to show up and talk about himself for 2 hours, and yet they do, and that is significant. I also think, on the other side, I went to one Kamala rally. I went to her last big one in Philadelphia, but I also talked to people coming out of one in Atlanta. In the Atlanta one, because Georgia has such a culture of early voting, almost all the people I talked to who went to that had already voted, and almost all of them were organisers helping get other people voting early, and some of them were poll workers. So a kind of ultra-engaged crowd. I was really struck by how online the crowd were, just how many kind of memes they mentioned, and not fun memes, really kind of granular things that had been stories for less than 24 hours for journalists to obsess over and then moved on. People who had hit everything and were really, really into her. But when I just straight up asked them, how's it going to go, all of the Kamala people would kind of slightly grit their teeth, and they had this expression of not fear, but sort of intense sobriety about how they felt it was going to go. And no one said, she's definitely going to win. She's definitely going to win Georgia. It just, what that feeling was not in the air. And you saw it at rallies of hers as well. She could get that euphoria out of a crowd personally, but she was also attracting a segment of her base to these rallies, much as Trump does, who are already there. So we all paid attention to the spectacle of the Harris thing, which was very powerful and enormous, and the amount of money it pulled in was incredible. But that turned out not to be indicative of how the electorate felt. It just wasn't. And so it's a lesson for coverage that, it was very much coverage based on vibes. And you need to be clairvoyant to be a personal on-the-ground reporter and actually report on how the electorate is behaving in the absence of very detailed polling. Most of the polling, for instance, turned out not to be very wrong, which people thought it would be. I had a feeling toward the end that her campaign were working extremely hard to dispel any impression that they were running away with it or that it was falling their way. They put an enormous amount, and if you were on their email list, it was absolutely interminable. They put an enormous amount of weight behind the narrative that we are the underdog, we're falling behind, he's completely swamping us with money, he's completely swamping us with ads, nothing can be taken for granted. Part of me wondered if that was a strategy to make sure people turned out who were assuming she was going to win. It sounds now from every interview that anyone's done with people on her campaign that it was just true. And it says something that we no longer read things that come from campaigns at face value. But so there was no... The story that's being written now as people try and settle on their preferred narrative for what went wrong is interesting because no one is blaming her as an individual. It's very unusual for a losing candidate to come out of an election this well as an individual.
Yesterday I listened to Pod Save America did a interview with the senior staff.
That they did.
And I think David Plouffe made the point that between early August or end of July, she became the nominee.
End of July, I think.
Between then and election day, her approval rating jumped 15%.
Yeah.
And after the election, it's continued to grow.
Yes, has basically, for now, withdrawn from public life. But that's exactly the point. And they, the interesting thing about that interview is that Plouffe is not one of these, but Jen O'Malley-Dillon, the campaign manager, not only did Harris inherit from Biden, but had played a big role in trying to stave off the pressure to get rid of him, and had worked for him for a very long time. And so there is this element of, on the one hand, it was too late for Kamala to come in and throw everyone out and build her own campaign. It was just too late. On the other hand, she was working with people who had not worked for or with her before, personally at length, who had set up a campaign that wasn't necessarily the campaign you would have built around her, and who may have made some, everyone has to make calculations and educated guesses. Some of theirs might not have paid off. That may not indicate anything about their level of skill or intelligence, but a lot will have been baked in by the end of July, whoever the candidate would have been. It also reminded me, that interview, that there was something eerie about that interview, and that they were talking about the campaign in a tone as if it was just a normal election. Sort of saying, well, ultimately we feel like the candidate performed really well, and where we managed to expose people to the candidate, all of our data showed a great response. It was very consultant speak, very emotionally flat for the most part, that discussion. Plouffe, less so. But he was brought in by her quite late to sort of Obamify the campaign. But that interview is missing the kind of tragic fact of the campaign, that you had someone popular, you had someone who was able, it seems, to lessen the swing away from the Democrats in the states where they actually campaigned, and it just wasn't enough, and the stakes are insanely high, the highest stakes of an election since the Civil War, easily. And so hearing them talk about it as basically a corporate kind of end of year evaluation was sad. And obviously it's inevitable. It's their job. It's how they operate. It's what they have to do to make sure that there is another one. They have to be able to think lucidly. But the gap between that and the energy of the campaign itself is very depressing.
I mean, we'll get on to that. But first, I sort of want to know, what was election night for you? Watching the results?
Was CNN on in the background and working live with the news website I currently freelance for, and it was a lot of pre-writing of mini pieces to go out when states were called, for instance. And there was a point in the night where we stopped checking our Harris wins, insert swing state ones. Not because she'd lost, but because it just felt like we needed to start allocating our effort toward Trump. That's where you feel the swing happen. It's where you feel your attention moving. I can't put my finger on when that was. I think it was when it became clear that she was struggling to win Georgia. Georgia wasn't called for him until fairly late on, but when it became clear that it really was just not looking likely that she would win Georgia, or that she would win Michigan. But it didn't feel like 2016, when I was also up all night in some newsroom. 2016 was a shock, and it was not what anyone had expected to happen. Anyone who says they did is probably, frankly, bullshitting. It was not expected to happen. The other thing about 2016 being the result on the night was not only clear, but it was clearly incredibly close, to the point where if Clinton had not the following day said, I concede this, the peaceful transfer of power is everything, I will do everything to help the transition, which is, in a way, she doesn't get points for that. That's just what you should say. It's only Trump who's made saying it seem noble. But had she not done that, there very much could have been a proliferation of theories about how the election had been stolen or how counting error had, because he won, I think, Wisconsin or Pennsylvania by 0.23%. And he won the Electoral College by 100,000 voters spread across 3 states. If she had not put a lid on it, you could have had a proliferation of conspiracy theory, of legal stuff that would have gone nowhere because he did win. This time didn't feel like that. This time felt decisive, permanent. The whole night had a steady downward trajectory. You were not hearing from the Harris campaign, you were not hearing belligerent messages coming out all night saying, stop saying we're going to lose North Carolina, we're about to win North Carolina. They were quite quiet and quite withdrawn. And that was a sign as well. It helped inform the tone of particularly the broadcast coverage, because there was just nothing being fed in from the Democrats that was to boost confidence. There wasn't. Now, it has to be said, they staged a lovely big event for her. They set it up to be ready for her to win. And they had to close it at 12 because they needed the venue back, which is exactly what happened to Clinton in 2016. Horribly. And I just remember that night so well. It was so miserable. But in the air, on the day and on the night, there was nothing saying, wait, what? It was an outcome that everyone had entertained the possibility of for so long. What I will also say is, the next day I was in Philadelphia, and then after that went to DC. The atmosphere was just like the grave. I mean, Philadelphia did swing toward him, but she still won it. It was just silent in public spaces, in a way that, but not silent in a terrified, shocked way, silent in a sort of bereaved way. I think there's also, talking to American friends of mine now, I saw some the other day who were over here for Thanksgiving. There's something in the air about needing these 2 months before the inauguration to slowly get over it, prepare yourself, possibly enjoy yourself for the last time before everything that's about to happen happens, whatever it is, rather than people going out protesting, screaming, crying, gnashing their teeth. There's none of that, because no one thinks there's something shifty has happened.
I mean, I think we spoke, it was either election day or the day before election day. I said something I was struggling with was, there was the whole story about like the fixing of the betting markets to show Trump win, and that billionaire flooding the market things. And so when you had that fucking Iowa poll, when you had that, plus the story about the betting markets, then the anecdotal stuff like how, as you said, boring the Trump rallies seem to be and sparsely attended compared to the joy and the multitudes attending her things. I said to you, it was like, something ain't right between these polls showing 50-50 and all these other data points, like early voting numbers as well, that the Iowa poll, and so I was very much like, sure, like, maybe the polar market's been fixed because it's generally accepted that the American polar market's a bit freewheeling, not quite as high standards as Britain, maybe. So I stayed up watching the 2016, and I stayed up watching 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But this time I thought I can't do it. So I'm gonna go sleep.
No jury would convict.
However, I couldn't get to sleep. So every 20 minutes, half an hour or so, I'd reach down, grab my phone, and check Blue Sky for latest things. Then put it back down, try and go to sleep. And same again happened 20, 30 minutes later. And there was one point, I think it was like between midnight and 1 a.m. Some guy I follow on Blue Sky, just like random follow, wasn't too sure who he was, had skeeted something like, these returns from Georgia, I'm starting to feel sick.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of threw my phone back down and was like, I can't go through 6 or 7 hours of this, of up, down, up, down, up, down, because...
Whereas I did, but I was trying to. So that's different.
But I remember...
The exit poll had a similar feeling about it, because in the US, exit polls in the US are regarded as quite unreliable because of the size of the electorate and everything, and there isn't one gold standard one like there is here on election night. So they aren't held up in the same euphoric way, and they're not really, you don't make a prediction based on them. But the one that CNN did that came in at the start of the night, and they started drip feeding out their analysis of the crosstabs of that was very unsettling when that came in. So that set the tone for them very early on.
I remember when I saw this skeet, it was playing in my mind, and it was like, oh, who even is this guy? Just like, I think I just followed him randomly. Like, what the hell does he know? And it was playing in my mind for a good 10, 20 minutes. So I grabbed my phone again, clicked on his profile, and the first word in his bio was cephalogist. And I thought, oh, fuck. And then it was sort of falling in and out of sleep, but not for very long. Grabbing my phone. I'm sure you follow Brian Derrick.
Yes.
I set notifications for his stories. So there was a notification, and it was like, she still has a path through Michigan and Wisconsin.
I hear the word path again.
Yeah.
Trauma buried. Like,
yeah.
The path is narrowing. Like, the number of times I heard that as the night went on.
And then I think, what was it, 5, 6 a.m.? It was just across the board.
Would have been by 6 a.m.
Yeah.
I went to bed at 3 a.m. Philadelphia time, 8 a.m. UK time, and it had been sealed at least an hour before. But yeah, it was awful. I will say that having to, on a side note, having to sit up and cover it and keep across the detail consistently for that long means that you process it in real time. It's sort of, if you elect to be a frog in boiling water, it is less painful, is the way I'd describe it. Obviously, it also helps if it's your job and not something you're just inflicting on yourself anyway. I think the interesting thing about the emotionality of the response to it as well is there are a lot of people who are furious about their particular analysis of why it all went wrong. The fact is, it's never one thing, whether it's a big margin or a small margin, not just in elections, in any area of life with measurable distance between two outcomes, where there are multiple variables behind them. It's never just one thing. Why did the Tories lose the last UK election? Yes, it was Liz Truss. Yes, it was also the D-Day thing. Yes, it was also people's feelings about how stuff is going, which aren't necessarily in sync with the actual reality of how things are going, particularly on crime or on migration. Yes, it's about Corbyn no longer being head of the Labour Party. A lot of people think that they can explain it with one of those, that is the fundamental thing, and it's just not. Similarly, in the US one, is it the fact that 28% of people thought the country was on the right track? Now, that one, for instance, I have trouble with because Trump being a viable candidate is part of the track the country is on. Similarly, is it people's feelings about the economy? Well, yes, except that since he won, even though he's not going to be president for another 2 months, there's been a lot of polling saying that Republicans now think the economy is doing much better because it's ultimately a vibe rather than, or it's thinking it's going to do better makes you feel like it's going in the right direction now. That's not reliable self-reporting. What it means is people are orienting a certain way. It doesn't mean that they're living in the real world and we are looking at it as through a glass darkly. Similarly, Gaza stuff, it certainly cost her a lot of votes. It did. But the other two things I'd say were at work are Arab Americans are traditionally quite a conservative voting bloc anyway. So the idea of enough of them voting Republican, that a few of the younger ones going to a third party, it makes a big difference. It's more marginal than it seems. And the second thing I'd say is that the margins are too big for that to have lost her the election. And people are allowed to vote how they want. I think it's a very silly thing to do if what you want is safety, dignity, and respect and the recognition of human rights for Palestinians. It's a very silly thing to do anything that will get Trump and co into office. Mike Huckabee, ambassador to Israel designate, is now talking about endorsing the full annexation of the West Bank, which would not be a non-violent process. Leave aside the fact that it would also be illegal. Saying, well, I had to protest because the system hates Gaza. It's like, well, there's a perfectly sound critique of the way the Biden administration's handled this. I'm not here to excuse anything Israel has done, but it doesn't really hold water as a critique, and yet it also doesn't explain the outcome. It just doesn't. I don't know. There's so much picking over of it on the left, both the capital L left and the not pro-Trump left, that is ultimately about winning the argument with people who irritate you because they disagree with you, or you don't like their tone, or you don't like their obsessive focus on something that you think is unimportant. That sort of argument is not the same as analysis.
You made a great point the last time you were on the show that a lot of people assume that the electorate is like an instrument to be played.
Mm-hmm.
And if you master this technique or you hit that chord, it will produce what you want. But actually,
and if it doesn't, it's your fault.
Yeah. And you sort of said, actually, the electorate has an agency of their own. And I've kept thinking about that, looking at the attempts to explain, actually, that's giving it too much credit. The attempts by people both on the far left of the Democratic coalition and on the right of the Democratic coalition to get out the narrative for what went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And Bernie Sanders, I felt, kicked off this fight by within, several hours of the defeat, putting out a statement saying, oh, the Democrats are abandoning the working class and that's why they lost.
Mm-hmm.
Which I felt was in
God.
just and as well as being factually wrong, just in disgusting poor taste.
But also, in brief side note, what he means by working class is what a lot of centrist Democrats use the term middle class to mean. There's also a semantic gap there about when people on the left like him use the term working class, it's normative. It's not just descriptive. It's about the idea that there is working classness, deserves recognition, has to be prioritized. It's about class consciousness. It's old post-Marx socialist stuff. When people like Harris use the term middle class, we in the UK would use working class to describe the people she's talking about. Those people in the US, many of them, would consider themselves working class, would consider themselves middle class, describe themselves as such, would aspire to be middle class, and find socialist descriptions of them as working class inaccurate and patronising. And that's an example of a problem that the hard left have, which is that when people who they think they represent and speak for don't believe or vote or speak as the left insist that they do, they struggle to explain it except by false consciousness narratives, which you can make an argument for, but I don't think I've ever heard a particularly convincing one when it just applies to an election.
You sort of had that reaction on the left. Mm-hmm. And then on the right of the Democratic coalition, there've been all these stories about like, Harris was too left-wing and, she was too into
her pronouns.
And I think people like Jamal Bowie made this point that like neither are addressing the reality of the campaign that we just all watched.
Yeah.
And like Harris infamously did campaign events with Liz Cheney and had historically Republican generals, officials.
She had Mark Cuban out there.
Yeah. And then on the other side of it, I would say she started to lose momentum in the polls after she did her big economic speech. That's when I felt the shift happened.
Yeah.
Which, and all of her, and put aside the fact that how policy-wise left-wing Joe Biden was.
Mm-hmm.
Her,
by American standards, we should say.
Yeah. Her economic proposals were even further to the left than that, and progressive.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you had a campaign that both appealed to Republicans because they would be essential to getting it over the line.
Yeah.
In terms of a win. You had economic policies that if Bernie Sanders was proposing them, these people would be all over.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, with the defeat, both sides are sort of like, well, if you'd hit this chord, or if you hadn't hit that chord,
mm-hmm.
the whole thing would have been different.
Yeah.
And then it comes back to what you were saying about the electorate has an agency of their own. I have sort of been thinking of like, given Trump seemed to run, by generally accepted standards, a bad campaign.
Mm-hmm.
A technically bad campaign.
Particularly in the last kind of third of it.
Yeah. And given Harris is generally accepted to have ran a very good campaign, especially in 100 days.
Yeah.
To what extent did any of it matter? And it was purely the collective consciousness of the electorate deciding what they wanted in that moment,
mm-hmm.
based on vibe, mood, inflation, macro stuff. So that's what.
Well, there are a few things. I think that, to go back to what I said earlier, everyone within the Democratic Party will have a thing that she did or didn't do that pissed them off, that they will now make their pet explanation. And not just in the party, I mean in the commentariat as well, in the culture more broadly, all over the world, will have their pet thing that they think either overstepped a line that made her untenable for too many people or represented lack of courage when it came to earning support from more people. I don't really think that's how you win and lose elections, because I think that puts far too much faith in just pure narrative analysis in a way. I think it also overlooks that there are trade-offs between different, whether it's different demographics or different regions. You cannot run a 50-state ground game election in the US with the electoral college system in place, for instance. So it's inevitably distorted where your effort goes and who you pay attention to and what you do to get there. So, for instance, the Liz Cheney thing. No one's opinions about Liz Cheney are not set. To the extent anyone cares, which I think is quite a small extent, people already know what they think. People already knew that Liz Cheney had endorsed her. People already knew about anyone who has, on the left, a deep repulsion to Liz Cheney. The number of people whose repulsion against her is so extreme that they overlook her work on the January 6th committee and who don't care that she has taken a stand specifically against Trump. The number of people so offended by her presence anywhere near the campaign that they wouldn't vote for Harris is going to be very small. And we need to go back always to the margins in these swing states were not very small. Similarly, on, say, the Democrats are too radical on trans stuff. They're not actually very radical on trans stuff. They're not. By global standards, they're quite mainstream. Most Americans, in all of the polling that's out there about this, do not rank it as a particularly big concern of theirs. Most of them do not know, knowingly, trans people and are not across all of the craziness of extreme left-wing politics. And it's true that some left-wing identity politics is extreme. It just also involves a very small number of people, loud people, but you're not really likely to encounter them in your everyday life very often.
And on that PSA interview with the senior staff, I think Plouffe made the point that not everyone sees the campaigns the same because of the way sort of ads are targeted and everything like that.
Yeah, if you're a black man in Georgia, you get a very different campaign than if you are a white college student in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
So, there's a lot of talk about the trans ad that Trump finished with.
Yeah.
And Plouffe made the point that if you are, say, a Democrat in California and you see that ad and you see a visible lack of pushback on it, you sort of assume and you buy into, say, the right-wing rhetoric that was what won it. And so if you're a Republican or you're a Trump supporter, it's like there's juice in going after trans people.
Yeah.
If you're Democrat or or further left of the mainstream of the Democrats, you're like, that shows the cowardness in the campaign. And Plouffe sort of made the point that from their data, the most effective Trump ad was about Bidenomics.
Yeah.
That was the one that actually made people switch for him.
And defined the terms of the choice.
Yeah. Quentin Fawkes says that, to be frank, the trans ad was designed to suppress support from black men.
Yeah.
So again, it's trying to disentangle the election that actually happened and the election that everyone wants to believe happened in order to win the factional fight coming.
Well, and to, the most cynical version of it is to win the contest to be the next head of the DNC. Is to sell an explanation to the most people who are involved in choosing who that is. I mean, that's a big part of this too. The other thing that I remember from the discussion of that ad was what that ad did was it meant that the trans ad was that there were loads of interviews in which they had to talk about trans stuff and defend trans people and not the economy. It wasn't that everyone who saw the ad freaked out about trans people or cared particularly strongly about them. It's that she could not allow that ad to go unchallenged for tactical reasons and for principled reasons. And that's however many interviews and however many ads that they're not running about prices, about the wall, whatever, the border, etc., etc. The other thing on this side of it, I think, is difficult for a lot of people on the left to say, and I think really it's not just that they don't have permission to say it, they really don't want to believe it, is this thing of it is possible that there is a meaningful number of, to take just one example, of black male voters who are motivated to vote against what they see as over radical gender ideology, as they would call it. The people who are making this argument would call it gender ideology, by which they mean an acceptance of trans people, prioritizing it as an issue, etc. A lot of people on the left, and it's true in this country as well, are furious at any suggestion that, quote unquote, their people would deeply disagree with them on moral issues. That, to me, is not a very democratic way, smallly democratic, of reading the results of an election, because it denies the idea that voters have their own opinions. A similar one is, a conveniently overlooked thing that a huge proportion of police officers and Border Patrol agents are black and Hispanic. So when you're selling a message on the left, that those are white supremacist institutions, there's certainly an argument there about the system they uphold and protect. But to people who work in them and families of people who work in them, it just sounds like nonsense. And it overlooks the fact that they exist and are real and have their own opinions. And most police officers don't kill people based on their race. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean it's not a horrifying, serious, and immediate problem. But if you try and manifest a reality with the idea that if we just say this enough, so many of, quote unquote, our people will show up and vote, it will swamp everything else. People know when they're being taken for granted and talked down to. And we've seen that in this country, and we've seen that in loads of other countries. It's one thing, it's a big part of, to go very UK on it briefly, it's a very big part of the story of the comeback of the Lib Dems since 2019, is identifying safe Tory seats, which have also often had Tory councils for a very long time. Very few of them do anymore. And the number one thing people say, other than it takes too long for an ambulance to get to my house, and there's sewage in my river, what's that about? I can't afford enough food. The number one thing people say fundamentally is, I am taken for granted because the Tories think this is a safe seat. And they do not do enough casework. The government isn't responsive to us, and they don't look after areas like ours because they're obsessed with swing seats in the north. Almost all of those Tory MPs have now lost their seats. And there's an element of that in this American election too, of the arguments that the Democrats are having are about how I should feel about something that I can't see anywhere around me. And instead, a dozen eggs cost me $7 when it used to cost me $2.50, and I've got kids to feed, and they have not mentioned it once. Now, they have mentioned it. They've acknowledged it's a problem. The problem politically is that they've also been in government for 4 years, and you can't get around that. If you're going to afford voters the agency that democracy implies that they have, you have to accept that their feelings are real. Doesn't mean their informational assessment is accurate, but you can't just turn around and say, well, you voted wrong. Or you can, and then you adopt a very different kind of political thinking. As Roxane Gay wrote an essay about this in the New York Times, where she just said, no other group of people besides Trump voter, no other group of people in the US is coddled in the same way that they are. I mean, everyone talks about them as if they are trying desperately to communicate to us something that we can't hear because they talk on a different frequency to us, and they're all in desperate pain and they're all in desperate agony. And she said, actually, they know what they're voting for. They do. And they know it's at minimum incredibly risky economically. They know that he is promising to hurt people and that he is corrupt and that he is appointing blah, blah, blah. None of this is something that has been hidden from them. Trump has said it himself to them, and they're still voting for him. And there's no other group of people that in the mainstream center you would say, well, they didn't mean it. If Harris had won and there had been a huge swing in the Puerto Rican vote towards her, which there wasn't really, I don't think, certainly not in the areas where she needed it, no one would have said, well, they don't really support her, because everyone thinks they should support her. So no one would suggest that they are susceptible to supporting her. I think when it comes to piecing up what happened, you have to start with the assumption that most people voted for what they wanted to vote for. And that includes people who voted third party because of, say, Gaza or whatever you want to pick. There's more than one issue there.
I mean, I don't want to beat the left with a stick too much.
Themselves perfectly well.
Because I sort of feel like the Democrats need to coalition build, and the left is part of that coalition, and people on the right of that coalition are also getting into this factional fight. However, I have yet to find a reason to engage with Hasan Piker beyond looking at his armpits.
Who is this? Not one I know.
Okay, well, you will really like him visually. But he was on...
I trust you're editing this.
No. He was on... I saw when I was going through and looking at for the David Plouffe and the senior staff interview, I saw that he's just been interviewed by Pod Save America. And Hasan Piker is very, very on the left. Mm-hmm. Very Bernie bro dude. Imagine a hot Aaron Bastani. And basically the episode title of his interview is Get Those Incels Into Work. And for me, I have yet to listen to the interview, so I don't know, but to me, it kind of smacks of, firstly, false consciousness. Yeah. Secondly, deliverism. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, that I would say it's generally accepted that if there is one thing that cost the Democrats the election, it is inflation and the sort of the worldwide trend of governments being punished for inflation over 2022, 23.
Mhm.
There is no acknowledgement on the left that a lot of their policies, advocated by people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, were and are inflationary. So I think it was last year that Elizabeth Warren went on a big tirade against the Fed chair, Jay Powell, for not bringing interest rates down sooner.
Yeah.
And that he would be crashing the American economy if he didn't do that sooner. Now, arguably, the Fed brought down interest rates exactly when they felt they needed to get that soft landing of the American economy. If they had lowered interest rates when, say, Elizabeth Warren wanted them to, you might have seen inflation continue to be a problem or get worse. And so that would have created the problem that, even worse, that would have cost the Democrats the election. It frustrates me in many areas, but there's no sort of ideologically and policy coherent positions among these people.
Yeah.
And so that's what really frustrates me about the left. It's like, okay, there is nothing wrong with you, your values, or your policies. They are valid positions ideologically. I just wish you would argue them in the real world and the potential electoral consequences of them beyond just a massive landslide for Bernie Sanders.
Well, the part of what I would say to that is that, firstly, these are the kinds of arguments people make when a big part of their political identity, a big part of their overall analysis of why the world is as it is things suck because no one's ever done what we would want them to. So there is a strong element of, because they are, I would say rightly, very focused on people who have been consistently at the sharp end for so long, and for many of them it's getting worse. They share something with not just Trump, but kind of various kinds of movements across the spectrum in many countries saying, screw everything, it's time to finally try this. That's a fairly mundane analysis, and it's not confined to the left. The left just tend to make it in particularly swaggering, caustic kind of terms, kind of tonally, particularly the younger left. I think to your point about inflation, the problem with the analysis you have is that people don't assess inflation by which policies it was that were inflationary, or actually what the rate of inflation is. They assess it by their everyday experience. And so were the stimulus checks that Trump sent out, and which then Biden sent out, so you could reasonably call them a bipartisan thing, were they inflationary? Quite possibly. But they also meant that people could feed themselves for a while when it was not guaranteed. I think that is less of a problem to me. The proposal of things that would in fact be inflationary and then would have been self-defeating. That is less of a problem to me than the idea that if you just change the way people feel about this one thing, you'll get them back, and that you will automatically get the credit for the change, which we know won't happen, not automatically, that you will not only get the credit for it, but then the fact that you did it will make it an orthodox go-to solution in future, as you want it to be, because the left have this thing of going to remake the system, we're going to finally pivot towards democratic socialism, or whatever word they want to use. The idea that getting it right once will be normative, there's no reason to make that assumption. But I will also say that it's also belied by the fact that a lot of what Trump is proposing is inflationary, much more so. And if it's not, maybe not inflationary, but, the tariff stuff, for instance, is if he does what he's going to say, prices on most things that people use and consume in their everyday lives will be higher. That has been noted for months and talked about for months. It could not have been discussed more explicitly in many more places. And there's a centrist critique of that says people weren't given enough detail and people weren't told enough about it. That's again not how it works. People were given the bottom line and said, if you want to go and find out all of the information, it's there and it is. For whatever reason, not enough people cared enough that his thing is a guaranteed wrecking ball to the way the economy works, to put them off voting for him, even though they are stressed about prices and consumer stuff. And the left cannot account for that because they cannot accept that people upset about the economy vote against their interests and know that they're doing it. And so I think that the idea that all choices and preferences emanate from economic negativity is just another pulling out of the air my favourite explanation.
And also, I imagine a lot of these incels have jobs.
Often perfectly well-paid jobs.
Yeah.
Good jobs. And also, a lot of people who don't have jobs didn't vote for Trump. So the idea that you can cure the electorate, that's not really a problem you're trying to solve. I ultimately think it's also very interesting how little talk there's been that I've seen about, are people going to vote for a biracial woman? Very little talk about that. Because I think it is so dominated by she was screwed by Biden getting out so late. If I had to assemble my own pet explanation, it would be some combination of the following, which is that Biden should not have ever planned to run for a second term. And he should have said in his inauguration speech, in my one and only term, this is what I'll do because I'm so old. That would have immediately neutralized a year plus. I think too many Democrats who know better for too long were therefore put in a position of denying something everyone could see. Every time I mentioned Biden during his whole presidency, to anyone here who is aware of American politics but doesn't follow closely, the first thing they all said was, he's so old. It was just everywhere. And I think a lot of, including Harris, a lot of people were put in a position of having to tell people what they saw with their own two eyes that were not seeing, and that's just not healthy. You cannot carry that into a campaign. And Trump seems much younger than Biden than he is, even though he is old and crazy. Biden just seems so old that it actually makes Trump look relatively alert to his surroundings. Terrible caution.
I mean, my assumption was always that Biden would just be doing one term. I thought
it would become impossible for him to do a second one, but I didn't know how that would be achieved. And it was achieved in the end. It was just achieved in too late in suboptimal circumstances, and too many people had to frankly lie right up to the point where he stood down.
Well, I mean,
and ended up running her campaign.
I always assumed that was his intention as well. That was my assumption up until he announced that he was running again. I could also understand why he wouldn't say announce in his inauguration that it would be his only term, because like politics anywhere, the moment that you say you will be stepping down at X, you immediately lose all your power, and you become a lame duck. So I could understand him being coy about whether he'd run again up until, say, beginning of 2023. And then having a process of a new nominee. And I think I said last time that I was initially resistant of displacing Biden, because I was sort of thinking, every time that a sitting president is either forced out or seriously challenged, primary challenged, their party loses the general election. Whether it's Carter in 80 with Ted Kennedy, Gerald Ford, LBJ and Hubert Humphrey, Truman. However, someone also pointed out that those candidates then arguably did better than the sitting president would have done.
Well, and not for nothing, 68, 76, 80, and now this one are some of the closest popular vote margins in history. And the idea that I think it's the biggest false narrative that began to set in, which is now slightly kind of receding, but is still there, is the idea that the move away from the Democrats was so horrific that she lost in a landslide. It's partly the distorting effect of the Electoral College figures, but ultimately he got less than 50% of the popular vote, being heard by 1.5 points. That is not a very convincing win. Also, she underperformed House and Senate candidates everywhere, which indicates something about the party's brand not actually being terminally damaged. If they run good enough people in good enough places, that in a year where enough people are prepared to vote for someone like Donald Trump that he becomes president, they can still hold on to Senate seats in states that the presidential candidate loses, notably, for instance, Wisconsin. Not a sure thing to keep, or Arizona, for instance. It isn't just that the Republicans won this lunatic candidate, which they did. They were able to hold that off when she lost the state. The idea that the party has collapsed, Trump dominates everything, and they will have to completely remake themselves to ever win anything ever again. Not only is it not true, but it's insidious because it endorses him as having got something right. He got something right in the sense that he won, but actually, if you think of it as he managed to balance his appeal to the right people to persuade and to sneak through in desperate times for many ordinary people, that is very different than he came back and everyone was glad to see him. And if you grant him the second one, even though there's no evidence for it, you're granting him a mandate that he does not have, including a mandate from the Congress, which, the Republicans in the Congress will be under a lot of pressure, to put it mildly, and particularly in the Senate to confirm people. The mandate they have is very different from the mandate Trump has because the Senate results were separate and different. My final thing I'll say is I'm fascinated to see who is appointed to fill J.D. Vance's seat by the not terribly Trumpy and I think term-limited Republican governor of Ohio. My favourite person for him to pick, no idea whether he would or if this person would accept, is John Kasich, former governor of that state, I believe, and former never-Trump presidential candidate in 2016, who spoke at the Democratic convention that year, who won, one, maybe two primaries against Trump, but didn't cut through ultimately. But who would be potentially on the crazier side of Trump things, a kind of potential Joe Manchin of the Republican side, who would mean that you had Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and him as the first, 52nd, and 53rd Republican votes. Vance obviously provides a tiebreaker, but when you're talking about nominees like Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth and RFK Jr. and Pam Bondi, those votes do matter. If you think you've got three who would never stoop so low, and you only need one more. So that is a whole other area that people are not currently paying attention to because they're so obsessed with the presidential result. It's going to be the next obsession very, very soon.
I want to thank Andrew again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed the show, please like, comment, share. If you can stomach it, I really recommend mine and Andrew's conversation back in October. There's so much we discussed that is even more relevant now. As you know, Christmas is approaching. If you need ideas for presents, check out the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page. There are books by some of our guests, as well as ones they've recommended. You'd also be supporting independent stores in the UK. The link is in the show notes. Hope you all tune in again next time.